Morning, everybody. I'm going to, I think, trot fairly smartly through the what, how, and what didn't happen sort of story of the Urban Task Force, and perhaps start thinking about the lessons question, but not in any depth, because that's really the purpose of the discussions. I'm an economist and planner. I'm not an urban designer. Well, I'm the only person here in a tie, so you can tell I'm not an urban designer. And when Richard Rogers rang me at the office in '98, whenever it was, to say, would I come on the task force, the others in the office were so amused, they were sort of slightly taking the piss and saying, Martin, this is a pencil. And the sharp end is what you draw, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not an urban designer, I'm sort of analyst of urban design and the outcomes from it. We had published a lot of guidance documents. We were kind of the in-house consultancy for the DOE and its successor organisations for quite some while, producing things like Better Places to Live, Better Places to Work, and Safer Places, which I always thought it was Better Places to Burgle. And then we'd done a lot of work, and this was why Richard had rung, I think, on urban capacity, on what it actually could be and what was constraining it. And so it wasn't just about density, it was about what are the tools, implements, constraints, and so on. And that was really what I was supposed to bring to bear. As a piece of context, this is a thing that Professor Ian Gordon at LSE sent me to show that don't get carried away with the influence of the Urban Task Force. You were important for a bit, but then it bobbed away. So here's the launch. Here's the sort of key people with the Minister, Richard Cable, on the day of the launch in summer 1999. And here's who we were, sort of thing. We weren't an expert group or a sort of self-dominated group. We were set up by the government in response as part of a great swath of initiatives at the time. And I put that New York Daily News headline because it sort of takes us back to a time when cities were really a source of worry. City, Ford to City dropped dead was when they were about to go bankrupt. But it was the whole concern, those of you who were around at the time in the work environment will remember that cities were a source of worry and concern. They're not now in the same way, certainly. And so there was urban decline, there was pressure on countryside, there was the 3.3 million new homes, and there was, with some justification, you might say, perception of low quality and poor public realm. This was a relatively new development when that picture was taken, and you can see how beautifully it's been realised. Who was involved? Well, the key politicians were John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for just about everything in our sphere, and Dick Caborn, who was the Minister who dealt with us on a week-by-week basis. And there were 13 plus Rogers on the task force, 3 knights, Sir Peter Hall, the great planning guru, Sir Alan Cherry, the countryside properties boss, and Sir Crispin Tickell, who was an environmental specialist and advisor. Key players were John Rouse, who had been seconded from English Partnerships and wrote very largely the report and secretaried it very efficiently. And Paul Hackett, who was Caborn's SPAD, who was the key flywheel linkage to the political machinery. So John and Paul were the kind of hinge of the operation in a way. The civil service much less so, and I met Dick Caborn a couple of years ago, and he said to me, well, the task forces, over to 100 literally, were an attempt to get issues that were alongside what the civil service were telling you. They weren't to replace the civil service, but you get 7 position papers from the civil service when you've got a difficult question, and you're expected to choose between them. Well, there are other options between the 7 the civil service have given you, and that was what they were after. And Mike Habber was his point about us as the task force is really underlining a point that it's all right for you lot, but you don't live 25 miles outside Halifax and have to use the car every day, all that kind of thing. You're saying, be careful about what the recommendations are in here, because it isn't axiomatic that what applies to Greater London and its suburbs applies to every other urban place in the country. We met 15 or 20 times over the year, chaired affably and not particularly directionally by Richard. We commissioned some reports and a small amount of research, and we did study tour visits to both Western Europe and the USA, as well as around England itself. We produced the yellow book that Paul mentioned, the big yellow book, and then later on, Paying for an Urban Renaissance, which was a sort of pitch to the Treasury and to the Commons Select Committee on Finance about funding, and then later on a sort of review that Richard commissioned, which I'll come back to, called Towards a Strong Urban Renaissance. And we did sort of sales tours. I did, I think, 25 presentations in the year after the report came out, which was, real sort of proselytizing the message. Enormous range of things, which those of you will know, who looked at the report, will know the sort of content, but also these diagrams, which are an attempt to sort of get out there the core ideas that we take for granted in the world of urban design and planning, about linkage, connectivity, catchments, all that kind of thing. That's just one example of the sorts of drawing. So the compact city was the core theme of the report. Sustainability was also very important, but not from a climate perspective, although Crispin Tickell was a climate expert. Really, it was about sustainability in the sense of impact locally, I think. We didn't really spend as much time as we should have done, perhaps, in retrospect, on the urban economy. Why are these places struggling? Why were we so worried about cities? Why are we still worried about Hartlepool and Rotherham and wherever else, Workington, we didn't analyse that very deeply. All right, you can't do everything, and we had 105 recommendations, which John Rouse said this year he thought was rather too many and not very focused. Here's some examples in our field of, in the sort of urban design and regeneration field, of the sorts of things we said. Quite detailed recommendations to government about what to do, what the tools were for getting regeneration to be more aware of what it was doing in the urban field, for getting design implemented and plugged into what was being done. I'll leave you to judge which of those under that right-hand column there, what actually happened. What changed? Well, policy certainly did. The Policy Guidance Note 3 was the crucial one that pushed towards more dense development, less undense development in particular, towards brownfield, away from greenfield, and led to the Urban White Paper. On design, CABE was set up and very influential for a decade. The Urban Design Compendium was produced, and we got focus and attention, I think. State of the Cities report by Mike Parkinson, the Urban Summit. There was a lot of focus in the early 2000s on those issues. There were also centres of excellence recommended, set up, feeble, a bit of a failure, and 1 or 2 funding initiatives, but very few, resulting mainly from our trip to America. Outcomes, well, I think we can all recognise that things were different after, in practice, for us. Density did rise, and low density began to be less prominent. There was a focus on cities much more, and developers were coming forward with many more mixed-use schemes. And the zeitgeist, the vision did get through. Again, quoting Michael Hebert, subordinates design to the larger project of placemaking, and then lists some of the content of that. And that is, I think, what you're all up to now, consciously, and probably more consciously than we were in the urban field before the task force report and those changes. We didn't invent the zeitgeist, we were part of it, and we helped it along, because at the same time what was going on was the rediscovery of the city, sort of back from the dead of Ford to City, Drop Dead, and the rediscovery of the urban block, which was a bit of, I tell you, a niche obsession with certain urban designers, the perimeter block, which is now more or less the stock in trade. You know, it's what we think about, how we approach laying out and thinking about the urban scale. And appreciation of the transport and land use linkage, it was part of that bit of the zeitgeist as well. There were unintended consequences, I think, I now have to recognise. Peter Hall had done, in the little 2005 review report, Peter wanted to put a thing in that said, I'm a bit worried about the lack of balance between the brownfield obsession and the tightness on greenfield. We were supposed to be doing about 60-40, 70-30 brownfield. There's almost no greenfield coming through. And there were reasons for that which weren't entirely to do with policy, but it was true, and it was also that it was too easy to build many more apartments. And that had outcomes in terms of the form. The density range became a sort of free-for-all. So even in London, where we had, with other neighbours, we had produced a kind of urban task force compliant sustainable residential quality approach, which tried to relate density to accessibility and to urban quality and so on. Even there, what actually happened in practice, the lid came off and density shot up. And you get, what I think you can see there is what I think of as, I mean, that's Battersea viewed tailing away towards the power station from Vauxhall all the way down the river there. It's kind of Dubai without the quality public realm. It's dreadful. And it's just a product of, oh, go for it, you know, who cares? High density is great. And housing, the housing effect is also, that, combined with other pressures, demographic pressures and so on, ever higher lived densities. Much higher now in central cities, and in particular in Greater London, than for 100 years. And the brownfield balance isn't right, as Peter was forecasting. Peter wrote this text about his concerns, and Richard was a bit pissed off, but he put it in the back of the 2005 report, on down page, inside the back cover, in about Calibri 8 point or something. It was scandalous. And what could have been different? What could have happened, just to conclude? Well, specific recommendations that were ignored. We said that you should, as others had said before and have said since, you should take VAT off conversions to give a tilt towards conversion rather than new build, when otherwise it was the level table. Treasury wasn't interested. Integrated transport policies, there wasn't really any progress. It remained good, public transport remained good where it was good, and it carried on being poor where it's poor. Actually, it got worse under 13 years of glorious freedom over recent years. And Richard and Ricky Burdett were obsessed by design competitions, and there's big chunks in the report about design competitions, trying to improve the practice here. Nothing happened at all. And even in London, where Richard managed to get it introduced as a design advisor to Ken Livingstone, the effects were very, very skimpy, I think. We'd all agree. The big picture is that Tony Blair was the missed trick for us, I think. Looking back now, there was never a whole government cities agenda. Actually, Rogers knew Blair before he knew Prescott. And they were on sort of the same page in a way that John and Rogers weren't. But there was never this whole government cities agenda. It never crossed over into the economic policy, and we never really conveyed the idea that this is where Britain will do its growing. People were discovering the city, but they weren't connecting that well enough with what you would do across the board if that was correct. And we crucially, I don't think Gordon Brown will have ever even opened the report, never got the Treasury on side. So there could be lots of lessons, as was hinted earlier, or it might be a bygone irrelevant era, because it is a long time ago, 25 years. And I would argue that's for the debate and the workshops, not for me to say. So my sort of personal sense is that, in the immortal words of Yogi Berra, it's like déjà vu all over again. Things are, some of the issues are uncannily, spookily similar, from 13 wasted years to the panic about housing and the impact on greenfield land and the danger of losing marginals if you allow greenfield extensions and so on. It's all déjà vu all over again. So, Paul, that's it. Thank you very much. Shukran kathir.